we can divide colonialism by Euro-Americans in Alaska into several stages. The first one of which we'll call, following the Williams reading, Russian Alaska Stage 1, 1754 to 1799. More properly, we could start this at 1741, which was the, quote, discovery of Alaska by the Bering and other expedition. And indeed, it actually started before that. There were some Russian ships sort of sailing and sighting of Alaska lands as far back as in the mid-1600s, but it was in sort of the mid-1700s that you started to have expeditions actually start to explore these areas more seriously. And that was partly prompted, as the Williams reading suggests, by the fact that Russian explorers were moving further and further east over time across Asia, right across northern Asia, and encountering Siberian peoples and interacting with and colonizing Siberian peoples who then spoke of a great land further east, right, which is Alaska. So that prompted some of these voyages. And also the search for resources after resources had really been tapped very, very heavily within Siberia. So specifically fur resources, right, which would have been very important to the Russian economy. So you have the Promyshleniki, and forgive my poor pronunciation of Russian, but the fur rush and the fur traders. The most destructive aspect of Russian colonialism, I say, was smallpox. I say the most destructive because, although yes, there were definitely, particularly sort of in the Unangash or Aleutian Island areas, but also in Dena'ina areas and elsewhere, there was certainly Russian killing of Native Americans. But at the same time, a huge population declines often were due to smallpox, rather. But again, also sometimes due to Russian violence as well. The Russian presence in Alaska during this time period was really and for most of the Russian occupation, was really kind of restricted to the Aleutian Islands, which is where it started. So this really started mainly with moving pretty aggressively into Unangan or Aleutian areas for fur trading purposes. The Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, parts of Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound on the other side of Kenai Peninsula, and kind of going down south closer to Juneau, or at least somewhat closer to Juneau. But in all of this, if you kind of look at a map of the Russian forts that were set up, and then the sort of so kind of the forts is the main things, these palisaded settlements, and then sort of these smaller trading posts around them and smaller kind of populated areas. There really weren't that many people. Again, never probably more than 700 over a pretty vast space. And that vast space of where Russians had set up fort were mainly coastal areas almost entirely. There were exploratory expeditions further inland, but they were often checked by native groups. Native groups didn't really allow too much internal exploration, which is, you kind of saw a very dramatic episode of with the Anna reading that you did. One of the points, too, that I want to bring up with this phase of Russian occupation was that oftentimes you kind of have a contrast of myth versus reality. So if you were to look at a picture like this, you kind of get this sense of the Russian colonizers doing backbreaking labor during the fur rush period. And certainly there was really hard labor with this, and I'm not trying to say that that's not the case. But very often it was primarily, especially in places like Kenai Peninsula, it was native labor that was going on, right? Native people were trapping these animals that they'd been trapping for centuries, and then establishing trading relations, sometimes exploitative ones, were set up with Russian colonizers. And so it was oftentimes sort of working in indigenous networks of trading and resource extraction into the Russian economy. And in that regard, it sort of contrasts with some of the ways we might think about what this period looked like. And I thought the Boris reading did a good job of that, sort of how you would have the rich man in the community who would traditionally reallocate resources from people's hunting. And in this case, sort of you had Russian outposts who then establish a relationship with that leader of the community, and then it sort of would just further this, except for now you were working Russian trade goods into the relationship, which shows one of the factors. You had both push and pull factors that were bringing native people into these economies, into these Russian fur economies. Push factors in the sense of when labor was exploitative or forced, which certainly occurred. But then also pull factors in the sense of people that were choosing voluntarily to take part in these trade relationships, Native people, because of what could be obtained through them, right? Among other things, all sorts of different kinds of trade goods, firearms, different things that Russians had. So there was both push and pull factors. The Carrie and John's reading you did, the oral history Lazamilian Natel de Gigante, I thought did a good job of showing that during this time period, as Euro-Americans, specifically Russians, but also to some degree the English with Captain Cook's expedition, as well as Americans and others, Spanish definitely were kind of, the Spanish Empire was reaching up towards Alaska and trying to set up a presence even further and claim it for Spain, well into what we would now think of as British Columbia. So you had all these sort of European exploratory parties moving around in and still largely unaware of the extent and nature of Alaska, right? This story shows a good example of how these exploring parties would sometimes go. In this case, the exploring parties were not just exploring, they were being very violent to the native communities, and as the story tells, whipping the chief, essentially then enslaving the women and children, and then telling the men to take a hike and go off into the cold, hopefully so that they would die. And as you saw in that story, a group of Atna men, which Atna are an Athabascan group linguistically very closely related to the Tenina, the Atna down on Copper River, the men then go and train, right? And I thought it was really interesting. They train with a medicine person and have this sort of shamanic experience where if you go fight this tree or strike down this tree and blood comes out, then it's sort of your sign that you will have success in fighting the Russians. And so they do, and they end up sort of destroying the Russian party that had attempted to enslave everybody. One of the things that I thought, so a few kind of interesting points about that. Number one is the way we think about violence and aggression within the historical record. So I think this is a good example of how if you were to only take the snapshot of what the Ana people did to the Russian people, it sounds like the Ana people were being violent to the Russian exploratory party in this case. And indeed, they were being violent, but the violence was preceded by other acts of violence, right? And enslavement and attempted killing. And so you have to kind of trace the histories when you're talking about colonialism to kind of try to understand the events. And sometimes these things don't get very well spelled out when we kind of condense the narrative in the way we sometimes tell history. I also thought the person of Kukta was interesting, the Denina man, who sort of intentionally misrepresents what the chief was saying when the chief was basically A, telling his attackers, do you know who you're messing with? And then B, basically telling his people, like, hey, it's tough meat. Like, you can't attack them right now. They're at full strength and they're expecting it. Wait it out and then come back. So he's sort of threatening vengeance on the people that are whipping him and also telling his people how to go about getting vengeance. And then the Denina man, and this kind of shows that Denina and Atna, their languages are very closely related, so the Denina man could either speak Atna or at least understand it well enough. He's supposed to be translating for the Russians, but instead he intentionally mistranslates, which then helped the Atna to gain revenge. It shows kind of the complex relationality that somebody like a Denina guide would have had with the Russians at the time, and also shows the agency on the part of this guide to kind of choose to, even though he had been allied, whether that was by force or voluntarily with the Russians, to then turn against them and work with the Atna. It's an interesting story. So kind of agency and resistance. All right, Russian Alaska Stage 2, 1799 to 1817. So before 1799, you essentially have a bunch of fur traders from rival parties going in there. After 1799, it kind of comes under Baranov's monopoly, specifically the Russian-American Company. In this time period, I'm not going to super get into it other than to say that, as the reading suggests, Baranov's time period, though short, is known for being kind of almost brutally, almost militarized, very organized, and more brutal. Russian Alaska Stage 3, though, 1817 to 1863, sees the RAC, the Russian-American Company, the fur trading kind of monopoly that gets set up, come under control of naval officers from Russia primarily. And this is also a time period in which Russian Orthodoxy becomes more powerful in areas like the peninsula, as there's a more sustained presence of Russian Orthodox priests doing missionary efforts to convert native people within, again, places like Kenai Peninsula. So that's a very significant cultural shift, right? So you have to imagine it kind of from the perspective of native peoples in these coastal populations. Again, many of the native people in the interior would not be encountering Euro-Americans at this point, or very, very rarely. But if you look at kind of these coastal areas, a lot of the interactions at this point have been in the context of the fur trade, right? And Russian people attempting to get native people to trap furs for them to trade furs to them. You also have, to some degree, violence against native people, particularly in the form of, as the reading talks about, and I want to be sensitive as I talk about this, but kidnapping and abuse of women. And so there was that aspect to it. But there was kind of a complexity there in the sense that there was both a very violent side to this Russian occupation and then also these like trade alliances. And then now in sort of the 1800s, we start to see a much more sustained presence of things that would actually shift the culture, not just sort of violence and not just sort of trade relationships, but actually something like the introduction in a much more widespread way of a new religion, right? And something like a kind of more stable Russian presence there for the time being. So we start to see more of an effect on native cultures that are in these areas beyond the already very obvious effects of violence and disrupted trade networks. I thought the Boris and Leggett reading did a really good job of talking about the fact that native people were not just sort of passive victims as Russian colonizers started setting up forts, extracting furs, and committing violence against people, and also spreading diseases of smallpox, which ravaged a lot of these native communities, some of these native communities. But as Boris and Leggett point out, Dr. Alan Boris, the professor who previously held this position, and then Dr. Leggett, Athabascan scholar, as they bring up, there was significant resistance by the Dena'ina population, right? So 1786 to 1797, several kind of fightings and things like that, particularly in the context of, as I say, abuse of and kidnapping of women. And this became a particularly key point, as well as did trade rivalries between native groups that previously might have been allied, but now that's sort of been disrupted as you've brought in, and part of what you have here is you have different Russian companies allying with different native groups, and then that causing tensions as well. In this context, you have the 1797 Battle of Kenai and essentially forced eviction of a significant part of the Russian forces on the peninsula. And this was not the first time native people had resisted back. There had also been sort of around the colonization of the Kodiak, some pushback that had not been fully successful, though Russians had moved on to the peninsula and through Kodiak Island. It's also interesting in the reading, in addition to sort of the actual like fighting, there was other ways in which colonialism was resisted, such as sort of reinterpreting the history to match their own cosmology with kind of the shaman war context, or adopting orthodoxy, or Russian Orthodox Christianity, but doing so in a way that was highly, highly sort of had a Dena'ina flavor very strongly to it, to the point where you ask, was this really them adopting themselves into Orthodox Christianity, or were they sort of integrating in Orthodox Christianity into their own Dena'ina-ness and nativeness sort of around the state? At least in the case of the Dena'ina, a big part of the conversion to Russian Orthodoxy came about as part of the smallpox epidemic, and as the reading alludes to, a large part of that was sort of the way in which that's the traditional system of belief, which had a lot to do with how proper thinking and proper believing and proper intentionality would lead to good outcomes in the physical world, how that sort of, for some people, some Dena'ina people, didn't feel like it. Boris kind of suggests that what's going on here is that they're not fully satisfied with, or at least that it's causing them strain in the context of smallpox, right? Why is this disease happening, especially if we've made these efforts to have right thoughts, right intentions? Is it our fault? And sort of Russian Orthodoxy provides a way of sort of answering that question and kind of reframing it as an aspect of part of God's plan and things of this nature. And that's a pattern that we see in a lot of indigenous cultures as they adapt to world religions, is that conversion to world religions can come about for a lot of reasons. But one reason is as you sort of struggle with new circumstances. Often the new circumstances brought about by colonialism, a new worldview then tends to become more appealing for that reason. That's not the only reason by any means that people were converting, but that was certainly part of the equation. As you can see, the Nanaimo population, as a result of the smallpox epidemic, declined precipitously. Indeed, it was about a 50% decline from about 1600 to about 800. And I want you to kind of try to like grapple with that for a second in your mind. So the smallpox, of course, coming from the Russian colonizers. I've never seen any evidence that that was like an intentional infection in the same way as like the infected blankets down during the Trail of Tears period in the lower 48. But it was just as a result of contact between the colonizers and the native population. The smallpox decline, though, 50% of your population lost. Try to grapple with what that would have been like and how traumatic that would have been. And the Nanaimo were not alone in this regard. So by this point, this kind of brings us to the middle of the 1800s. And you have Alaska as kind of as much a problem as it is a resource for the Empire of Russia. It had never been very profitable, I note here, and that may be a misnomer. In fact, let's rephrase it. Dubiously profitable. Certainly the empire was making a profit in the sense of gaining furs and needed resource. When I say dubiously profitable, though, it took a lot of wealth resources to gain the furs in the first place, to have colonies here, and then to transport these things back to Russia. So it was a costly endeavor to begin with. But there was kind of geostrategic concerns as well. We need to remember that at this point, Canada was very much still sort of within the British sphere of power and controlled by the British, what we now think of as Canada. And so they were the English, and indeed also the Spanish, but the English were definitely making inroads into this area. And Russia was concerned that they would not be able to defend the entirety of what they were claiming as Alaska. So again, they were claiming sort of the entire subcontinent as Russian territory, but they mainly just had these sort of coastal forts and trading outposts, and really never more than about 1,000 people strong. Not a huge military presence, really more just a trading presence, although later you have a lot of naval officers and things. So Alaska is not well defended if your goal is, again, from the colonizer perspective, control of the land to use as a resource base. So they didn't think they could properly defend it. And so part of the logic with Russia selling Alaska to the United States was that they didn't want their rival, Great Britain / Canada, they didn't want Great Britain sort of using Canada as a staging base to take over Alaska, because then Alaska would be sort of right next to Russia, and sort of the British, the UK would have sort of ready access to invade Russia into Siberia, or at least control their movements. And then number two, if the British were to take the land, and they wouldn't get anything out of it really, right, other than a very costly war. So instead they chose to sell it to the US, thinking that the US would also sort of act as a curb against British aggression. Sort of then Canada would be sandwiched between the US, as it indeed is, and remains today, although given the incredibly amiable relationship that typically prevails between Canada and the US, I don't know that Canada particularly minds that they're cornered, but yes, technically they're sort of cornered or sandwiched between the US, at least on one side. Not to downplay tensions that can exist between the countries, but for the most part, Canada and US are very consistent allies post within the 20th and 21st century. So that was one of the reasons that the Russian Empire wanted to sell and proposed selling Alaska to the United States. Was kind of geostrategic goals. And that is what happened in 1867 with the land purchase. And the United States paid about $7 million, which works out to, at the time, about 2 cents per acre, which is why I have the 2 pennies here. 2 cents per acre. And on a lot of these sites, I have pictures of native families, just because we're telling a lot of like European stories here of what happened. And I want us to never forget that like this was all sort of on the surface happenings of what has been an indigenous continent for millennia, right? So you have this sort of selling for 2 cents to the acre of land that really isn't occupied at this point by Europeans at all, right? The vast majority of the continent is still entirely dominated by, occupied by indigenous people, or not occupied by human hands, but it is not, is overwhelmingly not occupied by Europeans in the Alaskan subcontinent. In the sense, a relatively uncolonized subcontinent is sold from a colonial power to a colonial power, which is interesting, and it kind of shows the logic that was prevailing within both Europe and the United States and Russia at this time period of the 1700s and 1800s. There's a concept called the Doctrine of Discovery, which sort of was developed by European philosophers and theologians early on, and basically held that the first European nation to discover a part of the New World, quote unquote, the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, could then lay claim to it. And once they had claim to it, there was a set of rules about basically whether they could or couldn't take land under certain conditions from indigenous people. They tended to take land. But my point with that is that the doctrine of discovery and this idea of sort of a European nation claiming an area that it, quote, discovers. Again, it's not really discovered if somebody else discovered it first, but at least it was discovered for the Europeans, right? Whatever European empire first discovered an area, whether that is France or Portugal or Spain or Britain, gets to claim that land, right? And so that's kind of what's going on here is the Russians are claiming Alaska even though they very lightly occupy it. And then that was the context in which the selling, quote unquote, went forward. The selling at the time was somewhat controversial. Definitely some Americans thought this was a good idea by Secretary of State Seward. Others thought it was a terrible idea. And it was mocked as Seward's folly. Seward's folly, sorry, that should be not Steward's folly. Who's Steward? Seward's folly, by the way, where we get the city name of Seward, Alaska. So it was called Seward's folly. Some people referred to it as a polar bear garden, kind of dismissively, and basically just the idea that there was nothing there. People would call it Wall Russia, kind of a combination of the word walrus and the term Russia. People kind of thought of it as this like barren wasteland of just sort of that's where animals are and a few native people. Of course, there was actually quite a few native peoples, societies that have been there since time immemorial, all across the continent. But it was thought of as, again, relatively mostly wildlife and then some native people, and therefore not terribly useful as a resource and hard to sort of set up settlements in for the U.S. This is kind of a really crude political cartoon that was drawn at the time, as you can see the way that native people were sort of stereotypically drawn and mocked, right? It says the two senators from Alaska, and one of them's a penguin and one is a native person. So it's very sort of like dehumanizing ways of thinking of Alaska natives at the time that were proliferating in the press, at the very least highly kind of stereotyped and caricatured. But also kind of bears witness to the fact that a lot of people felt like this was a bad purchase. So again, you kind of have this like rival, you've got these ideas of Alaska abundance sometimes, but then also at this point, kind of this idea of Alaska barrenness, which is one of the reasons why the United States was able to purchase Russia for so cheap. Obviously, nobody knew at the time about oil or gold in the area. By the way, this 7 million figure works out to something like 125 million in modern American dollars. So even though, yes, there's been a ton of inflation, it was still a ridiculously low price for a gigantic continent.